This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacey.
Thank you and welcome to Risk Revolution, a monthly series of Voices in Validation brought to you by the IVT Network. The goal of this series is to advance the maturity of risk management practices within the industry by covering topics that challenge quality professionals to seek opportunities to improve and advance the ways in which they perceive and manage risk. This week, our series coordinator, Nuala, is joined once again by a regular Risk Revolution contributor, Valerie Mulholland, to close out this year with a lively discussion with another old and very dear friend of the IVT Network, Dr. Tim Sandle. So thank you all for being here and welcome.
Well, thank you, Stacey. And as always, it's good to be back on our crusade to revolutionize risk. And today, Dr. Tim Sandle has very graciously agreed to join us and share his many insights and extensive knowledge on managing risk. For many of us, Tim, you are a legend, a prolific writer, thought leader, and industry contributor across so many forums, and with over 25 years experience in a variety of different healthcare and pharma companies, but mostly working at the sharp end of the business as a pharmaceutical microbiologist. And just in case you think Tim has any spare time, he's a visiting tutor with the University of Manchester. And certainly where I've come across Tim on several forums is as a member of the Pharmaceutical Microbiology Interest Group, PharmIG, and a mainstay of very many other societies, as well as a good friend of IVT. So welcome, Tim. Welcome to Risk Revolution.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Nuala and Stacey, for the introduction. It's great to be here. And I must say, I'm a great fan of this continuous podcast series. I think you've really brought some really good analysis of risk-based thinking over the past few months. So I'm looking forward to being part of it and looking forward to the discussion.
Brilliant. So thanks, Tim. And Val, welcome back, an old friend back with us as usual. And we have some exciting news hot off the press this week. Val, tell us what we have for our listeners this week.
Yes, Nuala, a little early Christmas present from ICH arrived, the publication of the revision of ICH-Q9 or 1, stage 1 in draft. And of course, the expert working group that has been working on that has been led by our dear friend and research colleague, Dr. Kevin O'Donnell from the Irish HPRA. So later in the podcast, we're going to be sharing some of the highlights of that and maybe taking a sneak preview of some of the things it has to say.
Brilliant. We look forward to that, Val, before we finish up. So let's get started and dive right in. Tim, you have written or edited over 25 books, more than 100 book chapters to your belt, over 125 peer-reviewed papers, and more than 400 technical articles. And it was actually one of those articles that recently triggered our risk curiosity. For anybody who's a regular listener, we always encourage being risk curious. So one of your recent blog titles entitled Can Fuzzy Logic Be Applied to Risk Management in Pharmaceuticals and Healthcare opens up our discussion today. And in doing so, I quote, what you say in that article is often in pharmaceuticals, especially when dealing with biological data, such as relating to product formulation or to microbial contamination, things are not always very clear and can appear vague. And another word for this is fuzzy. Well, don't we know that? We've come across a few of those in our day, Val. So isn't this the essence of what we're dealing with in risk management? Things that are not always clear and appear vague. What do you think, Tim?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've hit the nail on the head with that. And I think one of the issues is that sort of many of the approaches that we use for risk assessment, things like established tools such as failure modes and effect analysis, are all based on numerical scoring. but the problem is that not all the situations that we have to analyze lend themselves to be defined numerically. And we can often find that our choice of a formal tool can often attempt to constrain us too much. So we're trying to be forced our deliberations and decisions into numerical or even binary values as FMA requires. So what's going on with fuzzy logic is that it's based on the fact that people generally are making decisions based on what is often imprecise or conflicting or non-numerical information. And the fuzzy logic approach recognizes also that there's different experts and different opinions and sometimes differing data sets as well. The approach also accounts for things like human error and different situations to consider, so that one thing that might appear, say, stable or more predictable in one situation is not necessarily predictable or stable in another situation. So fuzzy logic helps with that process. So it's one of the great strengths is this whole sort of situational and conditional aspects. It's also important to point out that the kind of the fuzzy descriptor isn't about the outcome being fuzzy, but as you said in the introduction, it's kind of in recognition of the uncertainty. And in science, uncertainty is something that we have to deal with. It's part and parcel of research and the way things progress. We often go in one direction and sometimes we need to go back and retest, and we might come to different conclusions. But what also fuzzy logic does is at the end of the process, there's something called defuzzication. So that then allows us to reach a consensus, and it helps to overcome the vagueness and the issues of imprecise information. So it is a very powerful tool.
Yeah, this really resonates with me, Tim, because, that concept of, the fact that many of our tools do lead us into this very reductive thinking. Some of our strategies we're far too early. We end up reducing down ever decreasing circles of what the potential problem might be. And we end up in this problem of poor problem definition. And a lot of the problems that we see at the back end, as you say, in the where we do end up with fuzzy outcomes with non-clear true root causes, is that the initial problem wasn't well enough understood or wasn't well enough defined. And this process of trying to fuzzy it, look at what are the patterns, what can that tell us, and then, as you say, that defuzzication at the end to build a consensus is one way that can really make us look carefully, very carefully at that problem definition. And I regularly use the quote from Einstein about, if I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes thinking about the solution. I think, I say that routinely to groups of scientists and engineers, because even though our discipline has trained us to, in theoretically, our discipline has trained us to apply that critical thinking and scientific discipline to the way in which we look at problems. I think our other human behavior drivers are pushing us towards, we want to be solution builders, and we want to jump into the solution sandbox as quickly as we can. And therefore, the other thing that's happening is we're jumping into conclusions, but we're also seeking consensus. So we end up trying to convince everybody else in the sandbox that this is where the problem is. So I think Einstein knew that problems themselves and understanding problems themselves are full of the clues to their own successful solution. So perhaps you could give us some examples of how this, fuzzy logic models could help us to define this uncertainty and vagueness in some of the problems that we routinely see on an everyday basis.
Yeah, thanks. So there's some really good points you've made there, and I think some of those, really show the potential of fuzzy logic. But I think the real advantage is that it provides flexibility for reasoning, and this kind of going through this thought process of considering the uncertainties of the situation, and as you say, focusing on the problem and the different variables within, without this sort of rushing too much to a solution. And as we said, there's too much certainty sometimes at the outset, and that can lead to important data, or also events and situations, as fuzzy logic directs us to, being overlooked. And also I think sometimes when the scope's too narrow, something that is important can often be inadvertently excluded, and too many risk processes don't allow that ability to go back and recheck on the original data set, for example. So this can sort of fundamentally undermine root cause analysis. So an assessment of all hazards that require assessing is really essential when we're undertaking risk assessments. And with fuzzy logic, the outcome of an operation can be expressed as a probability rather than a certainty. So it's all about that degree of confidence that we have. The fuzzy logic approach can also assist in solving a particular problem. And this is by looking at all the available data and then taking the suitable or best available decision. So in many ways, what this process is doing is trying to emulate the human way of decision making. And this involves considering each of the possibilities that might fall between these kind of seeming absolutes of true and false, and there's actually things happening in between. So if we take an everyday example, and this is one of the examples from the article that you mentioned, if we take the question, is it cold outside? If we were to be fixed in a sort of a Boolean logic process, as many risk assessment tools direct us, then we'd only have two possible answers. It would be yes, it is, or no, it isn't. Whereas a fuzzy logic approach would allow us to consider answers such as it's very cold outside, or it's slightly cold outside, or it's moderately cold, or it's actually not at all cold. And this is where, in terms of the numerical scale that fuzzy logic uses, then it would be a series of values between 0 and 1, rather than simply using 0 and 1. So if we take like a pharmaceutical concept, so let's say an item of equipment might be generating airborne particles. So it's not necessarily a yes or a no situation. It might be, does the equipment generate particles in all situations? Are the particles always of the same concentration? Is there a certain part in the timeline of operating that piece of equipment at where particles are generated? Does the design of the clean room, in terms of its air supply extraction grade, influence the problem? So again, in terms of like bringing different opinions in this kind of situation, you want to consider the views of engineers, of production personnel, of microbiologists, and they'll be approaching that problem differently. They may have different considerations of risks. They'll have different data sets. So the microbiologist may well have quantifiable data in the form of particulate counts, but the production in terms of how the process runs might be more qualitative data. So it's these kind of situations where the fuzzy logic approach can prove more valuable in picking up situations and variations.
Well, I really love that, because it gives us an opportunity to list what we know, the known knowns. And like in that example you gave, around a particulate matter, or airborne particles, we can actually, using the inclusion concept of getting all of these different perspectives from the different SMEs, instead of very often what we find in a risk assessment is that there's a them and us, it's a win-lose scenario that we have to present. It's my opinion versus your opinion, and we have to win out in that Boolean true or false kind of way. Whereas this is much more inclusive, in that it allows a variety of perspectives to be taken into the decision process. And more importantly, it also, what we're going to talk with Val later about the ICH, it addresses some of the problems that we have where we don't actually document well enough what our criteria was for our justification of our decisions. So in that sense, when you're saying, oh, there may be limits, or there may be certain points of the timeline, you can represent that in this fuzzy logic to say, between this limit and this limit, we can consider it the X risk, and if we go higher than that at startup, or or whatever that might be, we can consider it that risk, and it enables us to go back when we're doing our risk reviews to actually shake out our risk controls and say, well, is that actually what's happening? Because very often these things are designed, futuristically, with the intent in mind, and then we never get an opportunity to really go back and say, did we hit the mark right on that criteria, or the ranges that we assigned at that criteria? And could we perhaps look at widening that or tightening that as we go forward? So a really great way of ensuring that all of that knowledge is built into the risk assessment, and it doesn't just end up with the true or false answer on the right, and then you go back a year later and nobody can remember, why did we say that was true, or why did we say that was false? Val, what do you think? This seems to align really nicely with your risk-based decision-making work that you've been doing and that we've talked about in a previous episode. What are your thoughts on avoiding this reductive thinking, and scoping out these problems?
Absolutely. Well, first, Tim, I thought it was a wonderful article, and I really do agree that we should give fuzzy logic much more consideration than we do. To be honest, I used to be kind of fuzzy about fuzzy logic myself. I used to look at it and wonder, but the more you kind of get into it, and the more you even play around with it and try it out as a concept, it's actually quite clarifying, because it's so linguistic, and it is so much more aligned with how a decision maker is trying to tease out a problem and think. So it's definitely worth far more consideration than we're giving it. Particularly for those non-deterministic, non-linear but complicated, biological systems that we find ourselves grappling with and dealing with, for sure. But Nuala, to answer your question about the reductive thinking in particular, the Lofty Zadeh, I think is his name, the mathematician and the father of fuzzy logic, he also proposed something called the Principle of Incompatibility. And that is to say, in his view, complexity and precision were incompatible, at least in the human mind. He said we struggle to cope in our heads with complex detail, and we're constantly looking for simplifications and summaries and trends and graphs and charts and anything that it reduces things to a comprehensible representation of the information. And of course, the hazard with that, it removes the detail and the precision away from the decision maker. And that is something we've talked about before, Nuala, where, to be informed when making decisions, the risk-based decision maker in particular needs reliable information. And how is that assured? And how does the decision maker, who is often more experienced, but perhaps also quite often more removed from the analysis and the detail of that analysis, how do they ensure that important detail is not lost in that mapping and charting and summarizing and those reductive tools that we now use very, very commonly, day in, day out, in tier meetings and visualization boards, etc. We work in very complex data-rich environments. There's a lot of connectivity and a lot of signals from information that we have to pick up. But the hazard is that we would at the same time lose it in that mapping and charting and tabling and drawing that we do, Of course, ideally, if we have problems, we should be getting signals all over the place from our PQS, from our QRM, from our knowledge management systems. But there's no doubt, the more formal tools we use, and particularly when it comes to decision making, those tools should make us look deeper and harder at our data and focus on those connections and focus on the complexities. I suppose that's the aspiration and that's the hope. And I think for sure this tool has a lot to offer in a lot of the spaces that biopharma in particular, I think, works with, And I know we're not opening our ICH Christmas present till later, but just peeling off a little corner of the wrapping, do remember that ICH-Q9, the concept document for the revision, did look at some of these areas such as subjectivity and such as risk-based decision-making, and hope to offer us more clarity and encouragement to be slightly more formal in those spaces. So more on that later.
Yeah, thanks, Val. Yeah, you're absolutely right in what you say there, and I couldn't agree with you more. I do think that, the fact that Q9 is now coming back to look at some of these things around the issues of subjectivity, and our Boolean situation, as I say, is very much kind of driven around that, this SME versus that SME, is it true or false? And that lack of clarity that they're seeking to address now in the guidance. And that will help organizations really start to look at, at some of the current practices that we know are not really fit for purpose. They can be checkbox, tools. So Tim, you're probably most well known for managing and developing, contamination control strategies in sterile and aseptic and manufacturing areas. And certainly you've contributed a huge as a thought leader to a huge body of knowledge in that area for the industry. Have you applied any of these fuzzy logic concepts within your own work there? And did it help you, define or strengthen those risk controls?
Yes, yeah. There's probably if I just use a couple of examples. One would be with the development of a new autoclave for moist heat sterilization. So, and actually also helps us to link up to the temperature piece that we discussed earlier. And this is kind of linked to sort of like how long should a cycle be, and also in terms of the validation, but also in terms of actions that might be undertaken in the event of a biological indicator failure as well. And again, there can be sometimes a leap to go into FMEA too quickly and to try and be a little bit too certain as to the cause of a failure. But just with something like an autoclave and a biological indicator issue, there are multiple factors and there are lots of uncertainties. So if you take the biological indicator itself, it will have a nominal population and resistance level in terms of its D value, but we won't have any idea how accurate that is. The manufacturer's C of A will be based on different indicators, and we know there's great variety between indicators. We're also going to have going to the autoclave itself and how it's prepared. There's going to be approximate load patterns. There might even be photographs, but there's going to be ever so slight variations in terms of how operators load those. And although we might have precise temperature measurements, we don't know precisely what the exact temperature is in order to achieve microbial kill and to get the 6 log reduction that we're seeking. We don't know whether it is 121 degrees exactly for 15 minutes, or is it 121.2, for example. Plus, there's other factors of how dry is the sterile air going in, how many vacuum pulses are required, what's the heat up time. So there's lots of different factors that might go in to trying to grapple with a root cause. And then the defuzzification part would then be designing an appropriate overkill cycle, so we don't end up in the same situation again, and we've been able to pick up all of those variables and all of those different elements. Then to kind of think of a second example, if you take something sort of fairly basic but equally very fundamental to contamination control, like cleaning and disinfection of a clean room. I mean, this is heavily operator dependent. But let's say there was a situation where there's an increase in environmental monitoring counts. So we might have a theoretical understanding that, you know, a certain disinfectant at a given concentration for a set contact time will kill a given population of microorganisms, but there is fuzziness. And one of the going in with too much certainty might jump to decisions like we have more resistant microorganisms, or some factor has caused our bioburden to be higher, therefore we need to double our rate of disinfections. But if you kind of went in a little bit more with the fuzziness, and one of the things fuzziness is quite good at is picking up on human variability, human unpredictability, even what you might call human error. You know, what equipment does the person having to clean have, and what condition, and how good is that in? How fatigued are they? Is it always the last clean room of the day that the person has to clean that is producing the highest counts? Is it that that often be tasks done by two people, and some decisions been taken to reduce that down to one person? So I think this example shows the value of understanding the situational context, rather than just the jumping into the kind of more certainty. So, you know, in this situation, maybe the root cause is a little bit more resting on scheduling, or allowing sufficient time, or coaching, rather than perhaps automatically assuming there's always going to be one particular answer to the problem. So hopefully those two examples are just kind of designed to show, one, the complexity, and two, the uncertainty, and three, why a kind of multidisciplinary approach is often the most valuable.
Yeah, and you know, that triggers for me, Tim, that you know, because human preventable error is an area that I routinely end up getting involved in as well, because, you know, we might be looking at those behaviors, and you know, we definitely are trying to move away from that blame, shame, and retrain cycle that we love so well. And this strikes me as, you know, one of the things that I work with around coaching for these kind of situations is obviously the Gemba: get down there, go see, observe, talk to the operators, particularly in that example you gave around the clean room, you know, cleaning and disinfection, and you know, obviously, if you go down there with a clipboard, you're going to get nothing. You're going nowhere, you know. And if you go down there with a kind of a result of an FMEA or something, they're going to close down. But it strikes me that this could be used as a tool as well, as to start to open that conversation, you know, of, you know, if you've identified where all those potential variables are, it could help in that little interview of decoding what happened on the day. That doesn't get focused on the person, you know, that the person doesn't immediately start to become defensive and feel that they're going to be blamed, because you're looking at all of these variable factors, and it helps the person who's having that dialogue with the individuals involved to start looking at, well, it could have been this, and do you think there was that was different on the day, and it opens up the conversation rather than closing down. So I'm looking at I'm going to be using this in a whole host of new ways. And you know, that brings me to another blog piece that you just wrote in September for the IVT Network. Again, another lovely one on critical thinking. And you describe a really useful working definition of critical thinking, which I think is really what we're talking about. This fuzzy logic gives us another means by which we can apply our critical thinking. And the working definition you came with was not accepting what is read or heard at face value, and instead questioning that information, ideas, and arguments presented. And particularly in that thoughtful blog that you wrote, you highlighted the need for purposeful development of more critical thinkers within the pharma and healthcare sector. So what do you think makes a good critical thinker? What are the attributes?
Yeah, that's a good point. And a good critical thinker is, I think an excellent critical thinker is someone who can adapt to the situation and to be able to appraise the situation and to be able to ask kind of really searching questions for a particular topic. And they don't need to be a subject matter expert for the particular topic, and actually often works quite well if they're not, because they can often ask that key why type question that actually the expert can't quite see because they're so in deep with the particular issue. And I think there's like certain characteristics that can sort of help one develop as a critical thinker. And just to quote a few of these kind of like examples, I think observational abilities is really important, and also the ability to understand the difference between observation and inference. Because you know, particularly inferential abilities is about weighing up the differences, and that can be really important, and that can be boosted by, you know, good questioning abilities, and also being able to understand, you know, tying up two fuzzy logic, you know, points of ambiguity or vagueness. And just for a very kind of simple example to throw in, you know, I could look out the window and see that the grass is wet. Okay, that's an observation. But the inferences, you know, it could have rained. Somebody could have gone round with a sprinkler. If it was the morning, it could be morning dew, or it could be the local river's burst its banks. So, you know, you just can't take things just as you first come across them. Probing is really important. And then also I think understanding the difference between necessary and sufficient conditions. And by this, a necessary condition is a condition that must be present for an event to occur, but a sufficient condition is a condition that will produce an event. So the necessary condition has to be there, but the sufficient condition may or may not, or there might be different sufficient conditions that are going to lead to different events. It's also useful to have an understanding of the scientific method. So, you know, sort of standard experimental abilities. So understanding, you know, what a hypothesis is, which is essential if you're going to, say, attempt to invalidate an out of specification result, and be able to form a null hypothesis, assumptions and predictions. Understanding what is meant by statistical significance and the degree of uncertainty around that. So it's not just this is significant, and significance is not just importance. It's that degree of confidence that we'd have with a particular outcome. Another one, you know, which you might use in sort of research or clinical trials, is understanding the difference between an experiment and an observational study. So an observational study, or we're looking at what is happening, be that a piece of equipment or some people or a series of tubes or whatever it is, without trying to affect them. But with a controlled experiment, we'd often have two groups for which we apply a treatment for one group and not to another group. So it's a very different series of outcomes that we might end up with. And it's also useful to understand the difference between, you know, a randomized controlled trial or a prospective correlational study or a retrospective case control study. It's also useful to be able to weigh up different arguments and to sometimes try and understand inconsistencies or errors in reasoning, noticing any implications that might be behind a proposal, trying to be able to extract out different assumptions, being prepared for counter considerations that might alter the initial conclusion as well. So, and that they're all things that the critical thinker can put in place. And I say, with all of those things, you don't need to be the subject matter expert. You can sort of pitch pertinent questions, but it's useful to have a level of knowledge. So in our industry, we're always going to have differences in terminology. So some level of factual knowledge where you may get different risk terms branded around, or there's all other, we're an industry full of abbreviations and acronyms, and also have knowledge of some detailed element, some conceptual knowledge. So what is the situation that we're looking at? Can certain things be categorized? Are there some core principles? It could be like GMP fundamentals or some wider generalizations to understand when we're talking about theories or different models or structures, to understand the different procedures, where there's different skill sets, different techniques and knowledge, and also, what we might call metacognitive knowledge. So it's sort of a more understanding of strategy and whether one thing needs to happen before another. So we might call conditional knowledge, and going back to the context within which something happens. And we can also add that into self-knowledge as well. So, learning and skills can be useful. But it's basically that ability to take that wider perspective, to ask those searching questions, and be able to apply that to different topics and contexts. So, we can use this kind of way when we're looking at contamination problems. It might be there's suddenly the presence of fungi in a clean room, but we've got, there doesn't appear to be any breakdown of control. How did that fungi get into there? So you can start using it for that situation, or, looping back to root cause analysis, or even things for judging change controls. So the change might look simple, but the implications, if you start critically thinking about it, might be far more wide ranging than initially thought. So there's just some examples there.
Yeah, and we had a great episode a couple of months back with on that true root cause and critical thinking, and it's something that our panel guest that day, Rob de la Sprella, and myself have promised to work on in 2022, is around these skills development for scientists and engineers, and fundamental skills. Like you say, we're not talking about them having to be an SME or a statistician. It's really about that curiosity and being able to open up the conversation and look for patterns, but also look for what's the unknown, knowns and unknowns. Val, this really aligns with some of the work that you're doing with Marty Lippa, who we had on talking to us about the what we call the Lippa loop, or the risk knowledge infinity cycle. Any thoughts on that critical thinking skill development?
Absolutely. I mean, there were, in addition to some of the things you've mentioned there, Tim, there were some things I really loved. They really resonated with our work in your critical thinking article. So one was the use of and the importance of language and terminology and understanding the meaning of terms, you know, and you mentioned terms like assumptions and predictions and hypothesis. And I think we do need to take a lot of care there, especially as we merge our risk management systems with those of other disciplines, you know, such as even project management or automation or computerization, you know, that the terms mean the same things across that landscape is really important for us to, you know, to question and to assure ourselves of. But, you know, in particular, then the other thing was you talk so much about knowledge, and I love the fact that you drew that distinction between knowledge and being knowledgeable, you know, because I think we've reached a point where, I mean, I think the doubling rate of knowledge in the world is something like 12 hours at the minute, you know. So, you know, we can't possibly be experts anymore. You know, the goal and the skill and the tool is to be able to ask the right questions and access the right knowledge. And I suppose to recognize in ourselves, and you said that cognitive element, that, you know, the half-life of what we know is becoming shorter and shorter. So, you know, it's a real challenge to maintain the competency of expertise these days, because the rate of change of that information is so, you know, is so rapid. So, you know, to rely on tacit knowledge to the extent that we often do is worrisome. And probably that is why subjectivity in these processes is worrisome and does need to be managed, you know. So I think it's fair to say what we carry around in our heads is going to be less and less important, and finding out how to find out information, how to critique that information and analyze it when we find it is probably a, you know, a really important tool and skill going forward. So to come back to your question, Nuala, I always seem to take the long way around getting to the answers. Yeah, so our good friend Marty, Dr. Marty Lippa from Merck MSD, he's Executive Director of Knowledge Management over there, and he's part of our research team, as we've said before. You had him on a recent podcast, and you know, I'm kind of privileged to be involved with, you know, just working with him, and we're working very hard trying to connect QRM and KM, building on Marty's Infinity Cycle. I think you're going to share that podcast as one of the takeaway treats at the end of this this podcast, you know, and encourage people to listen back to it, because, you know, he and I are working very strongly in trying to make a case for that constant connection between those two practices and how they can be made in reality on the floor. And, you know, where is that information you need to make good risk-based decisions? How easy is it to access? How current is it? Those critical questions that are the linguistics, if you like, of critical thinking, trying to articulate those in these processes. I think that's where we're, you know, really trying to focus and maybe come up with some good ideas.
Brilliant. And before we go, Val, seeing as you're mentioning the goodie takeout bag, and you've already teased our audience with the mention of the Christmas gift from ICH. What about those highlights from the new revision of ICH Q9 or 1? What you did the homework on that last night. You lost one of your Santa sleeps doing the homework on that. So tell us what you learned.
I did, because, you know, somewhere in this time-space continuum between us recording this and our listeners listening to it, they would probably know more than we do at this point. Yes, it was just released yesterday. And look, there's a lot of information there, so there's a lot to digest, and I can't unpack it all here. But, you know, if you recall from the concept paper, there were 4 things in particular that the expert working group said they'd like to look at and address. And that was subjectivity, formality, risk-based decision making, and then kind of product availability and supply chain challenges. And the last time you and I spoke on this podcast, Nuala, if you recall, we were saying we hoped there'd be something about knowledge management in there, and there is. So maybe I should start there, because it does talk to using current knowledge for risk analysis, and it talks about the relationship between knowledge gaps and uncertainty, which is something Tim has referred to a lot today. And it does kind of highlight that is something that an effective and systematic knowledge management system might be able to help us with, and especially when decisions are complex and important. So there's a large new section on formality as well, highlighting factors that we should consider when deciding the appropriate level of formality to apply. And they are, again, these words are cropping up everywhere: importance, uncertainty, complexity. They'd be the factors that, inform us in terms of the level of formality that might be appropriate. And they've given us some characteristics of what a high and low formality process might look like. They haven't attempted, I suppose what they've recognized is it's not binary, it's not formal versus informal. It's a continuum. So in a way, they've given us what the bookends of that continuum might look like. What a low formality situation might embrace, and what the opposite, a high formality situation, might embrace. There's a whole new paragraph on subjectivity, recognizing different stakeholders may have different risk perspectives. They caution on the use of poorly designed risk scoring. That would be news to you, or good news to you, Nuala, not news to you, because you've referred to that so often in your podcasts, But interestingly enough, it firmly is replacing the responsibility to control subjectivity and to minimize it on the decision maker. So I think that winds very nicely into Tim's points about critical thinking also. And speaking of the decision maker, there's a whole page on risk-based decision making and a definition. So they've defined it as an approach or process that considers knowledge about risks relative to the decision and whether risks are at an acceptable level. And of course, there's a connection to formality with more important decisions. So perhaps we need a more formal risk assessment and risk management process, but perhaps we need a more formal structure around the decision making itself. So that opens the door on a whole new discussion and a whole new chapter for us. And just on the fourth thing, then there is a page also on using QRM in the context of product supply, including supplier management. Looking at robust processes and facilities, again, looking for those early signals in our systems. And finally, there were some little additional surprises. A paragraph on emerging tech and digitization was there. Not huge, but significant that it is present, and they've referred to it. A little warning about the inappropriate use of QRM, justifying it for past and using it perhaps to bypass what are regulatory requirements. And finally, is there anything missing? Well, no, I don't think so. I think they packed a lot into it. There's a lot to unpack there. But I think Tim just did highlight one thing, that maybe there was no expanse on the suggested tools, right? So the list of tools is the same. But I think it is important to bear in mind these are suggested tools, and the guidance itself says the list is non-exhaustive. So there's absolutely no barriers to following Tim's instinct on this and looking at, more useful and probably practical tools. And particularly, as we've discussed here, where you're dealing with systems that are perhaps non-linear, complex, multivariate, this does give us a great way of adding clarity. So anyway, that's some of the excitement in the ICHQ9 R1 update.
Well, thank you for your late night homework assignment there, Val. But I think it is exciting. It's stage 2. So we have, I think there's going to be a 3-month public consultation process. So we'll all have an opportunity to to give in our comments, and I hope people do. I hope the industry do. We've been living with the troubled teen that was ICH-Q9 since 2005, and it took us a number of years to get to know it, and maybe to get to love it. And then I was certainly in the hate phase, where I just didn't feel that it was, there was a lot of checkbox activity going on. So I hope this refresh will give an opportunity for the industry to kind of have a grown-up relationship with risk management now, and really look at how we use it as a business capability, not just as a compliance requirement, and that's one of the things. And actually, when you mention something missing, I guess we'll have an opportunity to feed it back. You triggered something that I hadn't seen when I read it last night. But when you say that, there's no barriers to following on Tim's instincts, barrier analysis could have been like a prevention, again, that whole issue around prevention rather than cure, which we've talked ad nauseum on this podcast around. There is a nice issue around risk reduction, but one of the best ways to reduce risk is to prevent it happening in the first place by having, adequate control strategies in there, and eliminating and, moving up the hierarchy of controls and eliminating and designing out those potential hazards in the first instance. And I think, the article that you wrote that we talked about previously, Val, on, the bow tie model, barrier analysis, and getting people to really focus on the left-hand side of the event, which is the prevention controls, rather than on the right-hand side of the event, which is the horse has bolted and now we're mitigating the consequences of that event. I think that could have been a tool. If they just added that one tool, and maybe we'll lobby. I'm going to start the lobby here,
Yeah, because Nuala, there's so much going on as well with reliability engineering in our operations, and it's such an opportunity to tie in while that is an emerging focus. I couldn't agree with you more. So next podcast we should all appear in a bow tie by way of visualizing our campaign.
I'm agreeing. Well, listen, I mean, I don't want to keep anybody any longer than we're already. We could talk forever as usual. Tim, thank you so much. You're an inspiration to us all, and thank you for your work that you continue to do, and for joining us here today. And Val, being my wingman again, thank you for that. Stacey, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate the thanks and say thank you to Val, Tim, and you, Nuala, for putting this episode together. So many great points and things for our listeners to ponder. And with that, what are some of the key takeaways for this episode of Risk Revolution, Nuala?
Well, we've got a whole holiday basket full of goodies. Obviously, there's the ICH-Q9 document itself and the presentation. We'll put the links in for that. There's Tim's Fuzzy Logic article. Don't miss that. And the critical thinking. There's 3 articles he's done on critical thinking. And we'll link out to our episodes with Marty Lippa and the one with Rob Della Sprella, and maybe back to Val's original one on risk-based decision making. Where we discuss that barrier and bow tie model. So loads of takeaways for our listeners today.
Excellent. Well, thank you once again to our risk revolutionaries, Nuala, Val, and Tim. I also want to give a big shout out to our producer, Ben Kitchen. And lastly, we're so grateful to you, our valued listeners. Thank you for helping us achieve tremendous growth in 2021. Please share this episode with your friends, colleagues, and online networks. And don't forget your 5-star review in your podcast player of choice. If you have topic requests or guest suggestions, we'd love to hear from you on that as well. For today's show notes and information on this podcast, including links to all those takeaways, please visit www.ivtnetwork.com. We'll be back again next week with another great interview. Until then, stay healthy and safe.